Hello. So in this video, we're going to be talking about computing absolute values. Now, strictly speaking, calculating absolute value, technically speaking, you're supposed to translate it into that piecewise form and then calculate it for reasons about sort of function manipulation and things. But the reality is that there's no real reason that you actually need to do that in practice if you have some specific number that you're using. So if you're going to be calculating this for a number as opposed to an expression or trying to do it for some abstract value like x, then you can actually just sort of plug it in and calculate as normal. Now, there are some caveats here. When you're computing values for an absolute value, you really want to treat the absolute value like they're parentheses in the sense that you have to do everything inside before you can really do anything with the absolute value itself. And importantly, unlike normal parentheses, there's no sort of distribution rules that let you sort of get rid of the absolute value partway through by distributing a number or something to all the interior. That's not a thing you can do. So the important part here is that if you're going to compute with a number, then you have to sort of do all of the inside without sort of changing anything. You do all of the inside at that number and then evaluate the absolute value at the very end. So let's see what we mean. Let's say we have this example here, right? 3 times absolute value of this quadratic, all minus 4. And let's say we want to evaluate this thing at 3, right? So we want to plug in f of 3. We do this like we would normally, right? We plug in 3 for every x. So I plug in 3 here and 3 here. And now I'm going to actually go through and calculate all of this inside, right? I'm going to compute all of this inside before I do anything with the absolute value. So that 3 squared is 9 times minus 2. That gets me the minus 18 in the front. Minus 3 times 3, that's minus 9, plus 1, just kind of sits there. That gives me minus 26 inside. But then, now that I have just the absolute value of a number, now I can look at it and go, okay, what does absolute value do? It makes that negative positive. So I would replace the negative 26 with positive 26 and turn those absolute values into parentheses. So now I have 3 times, now parentheses, 26 plus 1. And this I can compute, right? So 3 times 26 is 78, plus 1 is 79. There's my answer, okay? So the important thing here is that when you're computing absolute values, when we're using a number, right, as opposed to, having a x or an expression or another function or something, we're using just a number, we need to actually compute the inside of the absolute value down to a value where we can then actually identify it as being entirely positive, entirely negative, and then we can apply that absolute value, trait of making negatives positive or just ignoring positives and letting them be what they are, right? So what do? We talked about computing absolute values. In particular, we talked about how, strictly speaking, right, in situations where you're not using a number, like you're using, a variable or another function or something, then we would need to actually compute it in terms of using that, piecewise definition and all of that craziness all the way through. But if we're just using a number, there's no reason to go through that kind of hassle. We can just plug in the number, compute the inside, where we have to compute all of the inside of the absolute value down to one single number that we can identify as positive or negative, and then sort of apply the absolute value, making negatives positive if we need to, and then replacing it with a parenthesis and finishing the calculation. That's much easier than dealing with piecewise functions and all that craziness. Okay? So that is that.